Hello again. There's quite an ancient tradition of smashing up the statues of people of whom we disapprove. It was done in ancient Egypt. We saw it happen after the fall of the Berlin Wall with statues of Lenin and of course Dzerzhinsky, the former chief of the secret police in the Soviet Union, and more recently with the statue of Saddam Hussein. In June we witnessed a revival of this old practice when a mob tore down a statue in the English town of Bristol and threw it in the harbour. This was supposedly done on the grounds that the image was that of a man who had made a fortune from the slave trade. This action, the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston, prompted a spate of attacks on statues both in Britain and the United States. Some of them were bizarre in the extreme. A statue of Queen Victoria had red paint daubed over her, presumably symbolising blood. Another statue in America was also defaced with red paint. Some viewers might be familiar with the film 12 Years a Slave, which tells the story of a person being kidnapped and sold into slavery for 12 years. Okay, the statue in San Francisco was of a man who had also been a slave, who was kidnapped and held in slavery for years. How did the protesters who were so incensed about slavery react to this statue of a slave? Well, they daubed it with red paint and painted bastard in red paint on the statue of this former slave. I can't help wondering whether or not they would have treated a statue of Solomon Northup in the same way. Who was this bastard? Well, in later life he wrote what many people regard as being the first true novel. Before that, though, in 1575, Miguel Cervantes, was captured in the Mediterranean by North African slavers and taken to Algiers, where he spent 5 years as a slave. Algiers was famous for its slave market, of course, which dealt exclusively in white Europeans who were auctioned there. Why would people protesting against racism and slavery attack a statue of a former slave? I'm guessing that ignorance and racial hatred were behind it. Ignorance in that those barbarians who were pulling down and defacing statues had probably never heard of Cervantes, let alone read any novels. And racial hatred in that this was a statue of a white man, and that alone was to condemn him as a bastard. The interesting point to consider is whether those vandals were motivated at hatred for white people, whether they were actually black or white themselves. I've noticed that a lot of liberal and left-wing white people are consumed by shame and hatred of their own skin colour. It's odd, when you meet Chinese people, they're not usually ashamed of being Chinese. They're not ashamed of their race. In fact, they're proud of it. Same thing goes for Arabs. I've yet to meet an Arab who's ashamed of being Arab. It's one of those things that seems to be limited to white Europeans and white Americans. I want to think a little bit about that because it was mostly white people who threw that statue of Edward Colston into the harbour at Bristol. A quick head count shows at once that 90% of the mob which pulled down that statue in Bristol and threw it in the harbour were actually white. And here's an even clearer example. In Oxford, a campaign is underway to remove a statue of Cecil Rhodes, a British imperialist whose statue stands in one of the colleges. Americans are probably familiar with the Rhodes Scholarships that were founded by Cecil Rhodes. The campaign is called the Rhodes Must Fall campaign. And if you look at a recent photograph of a sit-in protest of the campaign, which is showed here. Here the protesters are all white, with one or two exceptions. It's white liberals who are determined to show how much they feel for black people's past pain, rather than black people themselves very often. It's white people who want the statues removed. I really don't know why so many young white people feel this hatred for their own race, for their own skin colour. I mean, it's true there's been plenty of violence and cruelty in white history, but there's a lot more that's good about American and European civilization than there is bad. This is why I suspect that it was white people who actually daubed that statue of Cervantes. It's the sort of thing that left-wing white liberals would do. Of course, not all white people are keen to pull down statues in order to show us that they are correct and right-thinking individuals. Some white people rather erect statues. In this case, a statue was erected on the empty plinth lately occupied by Edward Colston, and the statue was made of black plastic and made by a British artist called Mark Quinn. He knocked this statue up in quite a hurry, in a matter of a week or two, and then had it erected secretly in the middle of the night on the plinth that Edward Colston's statue had been on. Here's a picture of the statue that our sculptor Mark Quinn turned out. This statue shows one of the protesters in Bristol. Mark Quinn, who produced this statue, is a very wealthy white man and not really what you'd call a struggling artist at all. To give you one example, he has a studio in Clerkenwell in London. Usually when I'm hungry, I tend to go out to the kitchen and make myself a sandwich, or I might go to the shops to get something to eat. Mark Quinn's far too busy, rich and important for that. At his studio, he employs his own full-time chef, so that he doesn't have to stop work, so he has to use a microwave the way that you and I have to. It's quite funny really, because he has form for capitalising on protests and riots. After the English riots of 2011, he produced a tapestry showing one of the rioters, which you can see here. I find the reactions of white people quite fascinating when it comes to black causes, that they are so ready to declare their solidarity with black people. They're motivated apparently by their anguish and pain. I've never quite been able to understand why I should feel any shame, pain, guilt or anguish for things that my great-great-great-grandfather may or may not have done in the 19th century. It doesn't seem to make any sense to me for me to feel guilty about the actions of my forefathers.